One thing I'm not cynical about is our friend Steve Beer, who is a wealth of information, and as Betty pointed out, we count on him every year to bring us something new, and now he's got, and I'm not sure I try to translate from Betty's announcement as to what the topic is. This is procedures for self-assessments of your finance system, but he will do a far better job than I of explaining what he's doing. So to tell us what he's going to do and then tell us what he's going to tell us, Steve Beer.
You guys are so welcoming. It's so wonderful to come to speak for you guys. The topic comes out of something which came out of the internal auditors for large public companies. So it's really not in the mainstream these days as far as accounting literature, but yet we're finding it's really important as far as what's going on in the environment. The guidelines for internal control, so this is the cross-checks that we have both financially as well as risk assessment-wise, are very important. It's a tough topic to speak about and keep it interesting, so I will do my best. So I want to try to stay away from that this is solely financial, and I want you to think about that this has a lot of ramifications in other areas as I go through the presentation. And it was actually wonderful. I did not plant it, but on the back table is a wonderful list for risk assessment that I had never seen before. I'm not sure who we can thank for putting it on the table, but whoever that is. Charles, thank you. It was perfectly placed. So if you did not pick it up on the way in, please do so. It goes to areas as far as the running of the property and all of the risks of running to the property. So that side of this is really going to be helpful as far as absorbing what we're talking about. So let me just move to the next slide. And so the main body for the internal auditors came out with this is the definition of internal controls. And it's pretty straightforward as far as the concept as to what we're talking about. And as I'm trying to say, it goes to a lot of different areas, and it's not just limited to money. It goes to business strategy, it goes to governance. So as internal controls have developed, there have been changes, and there's a group called the COSO, which really is the ones who establish control structure guidelines. And I guess it was about 5 years ago, maybe I'm dating myself, maybe it's even longer. They had 5 sides, 5 principles of internal controls. We've moved now to 17 in an update that came out this year. But conceptually, the concept is cooperation, movement of information, and communication. And sometimes, as auditors, we can't tell that. We can only use inquiry as our one area to try to get a feel for that, and observation when we're in the office. But it's a really tough area for us. So trying to find a way that it's done internally and it's documented can be really helpful to our work. So our methodology is that we're going to try to make it a process that we do it together. The more minds always comes up with a better result. The functioning of your management organization, it gives them an opportunity to share and to meet and discuss and come up with objectives and their concerns together. Part of it is taking a look at what the present controls are over both financial as well as risk areas. And then the intention is to come up with action plans which will work to minimize the risk, enhance the controls. We get a bunch of objectives. So following that definition from the Internal Auditors Association is of meeting those business objectives, which for your entities is maintaining the best living conditions and experience for all of the residences, maximizing your financial results, and minimizing your costs. So what we're trying to do is create a better process for management to improve its operations and its effectiveness. And management is one of the most important internal controls. It's very basic, of a monitoring function on verifying things are done, making sure they're done timely, they're done right, and they meet objectives. Now, there's a number of ways we'll be able to implement this. I will get to that when we get further into the area, but the concept is of getting everybody who works in the organization together to bring in now the low-level persons as well as the executives, because we seem to find when it comes to strategy and also internal controls, it's a top-down system. And it works better on bigger organizations because the board is more they're compensated, as opposed to all of you who are here volunteering your time. We want to try to manage your participation. So therefore, it falls to the executive manager to do it. And sometimes it ends up just being outsiders and the executive manager who end up doing the aspect, and we really don't get the feedback from the lower level persons. This also, I sort of mentioned it before, as the control process is evolving over the years and improving, it's sort of a response to what, as outside auditors, we're dealing with for the changing demands that are happening to us, because there are some changes that are going on in the industry. And at the same time, we want to try to maximize our best representation that we can for you. So part of the goals here, I'm sure you'll all say, we all know our business, we all know what we do, it's straightforward as to what it is. But we find that when people get together and talk about things, other communication avenues that potentially just maybe get lost in the shuffle open up. And we find out things that we didn't realize if we address and periodically visit things. So this really goes down to a more scheduled, periodic monitoring of what's going on, and then also a more periodic risk assessment. While it does happen, we assure it happens as part of the audit when we do the audit, it tends to just get caught up in what do we need to talk about at this meeting, or what do we need to accomplish for the day. And somewhere along the line, a schedule of bringing in governance issues, reminding employees of the fact that certain things will be tolerated and they won't be tolerated, just don't seem to always happen. So we want to try to work it into a process that just works. As board members, it helps protect you from public scrutiny that you're doing your job, that things hopefully don't happen, that we catch things, we deal with risks, we minimize them so that there's not as much of an issue. And at the same time, we can expand this process to include enhancing revenue, because we'll say, okay, along the way of the conversation, are there ways that we can, increase our revenue, do things better? Reduce expenses, which is obviously an objective for all of us the last 5 years or so. And then improvement of operations is always a goal of business, and it's a good opportunity to remind us. I know we do annual reviews of employees, but this process, we're sitting down and finding out potentially where issues are, having these conversations, tends to help us see the effectiveness of employees. Things that we really may not notice tend to come out as part of a process of having the conversations and talking about these things. So we're really focusing on efficiency and our intention to minimize all of the risks that we potentially have. So the controls really, the actual procedures and controls are the responsibility of management. And as hiring the renowned professionals that I know, the clients that I work with you guys with, and I'm sure all of you have, there's an understanding that at this level that they are responsible, they know what to do. But sometimes it's a good idea to take a look at who's doing what. So on the board side, we hear a lot of times when we talk to the boards that they have the policies. They know that they want to get a bid at a certain level. They know that it's supposed to happen. But what we don't find is, other than the operations running and our inquiry, we don't generally find the procedures documented in a way that we really can say clearly that they're being done. So there are certain amounts of what we need to do a financial statement, which is what most of the auditors that I understand are my colleagues for your entities. So we're looking at controls that we can say that it's a reasonable financial statement. If we go through the process of an internal control evaluation, which is a separate type of an engagement, we may not be in the same position. We may find things, and a lot of our disclosures as accountants even talk about the fact that we're not going to be looking for issues of controls that are issues. We'll raise them if they do come up, but we're not looking for them. So I guess the question for everybody here to consider as part of this process is, are you looking for more? Is it just that we want to get the basic financial statement done, and it may be that there's so much going on in the property that it's not the right time? Or is it a good time to work something like this type of program into your operations to try to continue a strategic improvement of operations and controls? These are really one of the toughest ones for us as auditors. We can do a great job of checking the bank rec and tracing this and doing that, but when it comes to the integrity of the people, their ethical values, there are no documents that we can examine. There's not much that we can check. We have to rely on asking questions, keeping our eyes open at the client, and maybe instinct. And on the bigger properties, that's relatively easy because we're in the office enough. But sometimes on the smaller properties, that's not so easy. So, really this goes down to the employees' perceptions and impressions as to what the board wants and management wants, and the attitudes and intentions. And sometimes we find there's sort of a disconnect. We send messages that we don't realize in how we do things. It's sort of the role model issue. If we at the top, for whatever reason, don't do everything totally ethical and that way, we may be sending a message that people will see something, and then that opens the door on a more lower level. So having this type of a process tends to help remind everybody as to where the board really is. Looking at the information from a number of employees is a very opportune thing to do, where we don't always do that. So as far as our model is, we may talk to 4 or 5 people generally as we'll do an audit other than a really large organization, but there could be 20 people that are involved. We don't get the opportunity, other than rotationally, to talk to somebody who's, let's say, the service manager. We'll evaluate it and then we'll look at it every few years, but we don't have the same type of information. And I don't know that it happens on a board level, so I just want to raise the issue. For us, as I said, it enhances some of the audit tests that we do if this process is taken a look at, if it's part of management's work to do self-assessment and to quantify that that gets done. Okay, let me go to the next one. So what we're going to get is we're going to get an improvement in whether or not errors occur and if they're detected, because they do occur. So when we'll do an audit sample, we may find an error. It may not be enough that we have to do anymore, maybe under our radar, but errors do occur. And the question is, can we have operations that are effective with the employees and still can catch errors on their own? Monitoring is a really tough one that not everybody really can always focus upon. We're all busy. Let's say there's a major projects that are going on at a complex. There can be a turn of attention away from these basics. And unfortunately, that's the time where sometimes things can change. And is there a way that we bring it back as part of the process? And I don't know, I guess I want to ask you guys to think about whether or not, you know, you can really feel that without a checklist like we have in the back or some other method, that we're assuring that all the risks are covered, that employees in a day-to-day, without being reminded, are really thinking about all of the risks that are going on that may be affecting you. So I'm going to talk more about risk assessment a little later. Trying to get into each functional area is a wealth of information about controls, and believe it or not, it can be about the possibility that some type of fraud is occurring. I think we all think that if somebody knew that it was happening, it would get out. But I guess it goes to around the year 2000 when we had the big Enron frauds. They went back and they asked the people in the accounting department, did you know fraud was going on? And their answer to the surprise was, of course we did. It's scary. And it sort of goes to this area of, and that's my concern, I guess, is with you guys as volunteers and executive managers who have a lot on their plate. If somewhere along the line there's a breakdown and the monitoring. So monitoring is one area. And we get a financial report, we evaluate it. Sometimes on the volunteer boards we see the reliance on one person, let's say treasurer, that they're going to do it. And then let's say something in their life changes and everybody thinks they're doing the same review that they used to do, but it has changed. And the question is, do we know that? So, monitoring is one that doesn't always get down there. These assessment processes, as I said, they really get down to that soft control when you have a group of people talking about it, you're getting your sense as to where employees are, what they're doing. It really tends to give much more information for a deeper understanding of the critical factors that are involved. Like I said, I think we really assume on these soft controls that they're just happening, but we really don't ever have a way of making sure that they do. And So, and to optimize operations, while I know everybody would like to do it, the question is there a focus on it? And that's sort of what a self-evaluation will create for an organization. So it's not the financial statement audit. I can't speak on behalf of my colleagues, but we don't get down to that level. It's not part of our engagement. We want to make sure we have a financial that we can work. We do find things. We do make suggestions along with our work towards improvements. But really, unless we find it in one of our rotational issues, it's not going to do it. You know, when there are internal auditors, it doesn't replace that type of function that's going on. That's probably not really relevant to ours. And we're not going to find a guarantee here for an error. Errors don't occur and fraud doesn't, but we want to minimize that risk as far as possible. So I mentioned that, you know, as independent auditors, we're dealing with a very slow to change environment in internal controls. And we try to do what we can, but there's a lot of times where we'll get feedback of we're volunteers, there's only so much you can do. You know, we can't have the employees to do everything that needs to be done. And that's the latter part of this presentation. I just wanted to give you some examples on segregation of duties, because I think it's important. I think there's a way that this isn't as big as it seems to come across. And then there's also higher expectations in this environment, that the job is done well. We used to, you know, not have people feel that we have to have every answer, but this environment it's been developing that there needs to be real structure, real reporting. And then in internal control, I think there has been a step up in boards feeling that we're looking at more than is required by accounting standards. And the question is, with pressure on fees, how we do that and try to give the boards what they want, and at the same time be able to do our objectives as a business. So I know with my personal involvement when I have with the clients is that we do have a constant going back and forth as to how to improve things or what should change. We try to do it right on the spot. Where there have been issues of things that have occurred in the industry, when they look back on those soft controls, whether there was ethics and integrity, and my example about what was going on with Enron is the perfect example. It was off the mark because it's a really hard thing to do. So we want to try to bring it back and get to the best possible area we can for the financial statements. And it's really easy for us as auditors. We're analytical. Quantitative is so much easier than qualitative. You know, we can defend it and be more comfortable with it, but it's an issue and it's something that we have to work towards improving. We really need to know that both the hard and the soft side of the controls is existing. So for us as auditors, it allows a more effective and efficient evaluation of the controls. It gives us a very robust tool. And I don't know that as an industry, the public accountants have really embraced it. I know I have, but I don't know that it has elsewhere, and I try to encourage that we consider doing some part of this. And we sort of go back to how it supplements our work, and it also offers the benefits of efficiency and effectiveness. It's not just the basic internal controls that I think that should be, you know, evaluated here. The ones that are designed to monitor also are the ones that really sometimes need some enhancement. Okay. So now we're up to what needs to be done. So we have a couple of options, and one of the options is to set this up as a staff meeting to hand out what we know is the current controls, and in some cases where we've tried to get some detail on the controls, we really were surprised with what people would write down as their controls. And then we'd have to go back and say, well, don't you do this, don't you do that. It's amazing how people don't link the two who are employees. And so this is a better way to assure that we can rely on the employees to assure their risks are covered. And we want to focus on the controls. And again, the policies are the ones that most times we hear about, and we don't really get those procedures down. So one option is to use facilitated team meetings. They're the most popular way to do this. Bring in the employees who work on a day-to-day basis and have a conversation. Bring the bagels, bring the donuts. There are efficiency and effectiveness can be achieved with using a facilitator to guide the meeting. There are facilitators that are out there. Another option, which is always helpful, is somebody designated to be the one to keep track of the records and document what's going on and what's being said, because it's amazing how perceptions can change. And also anonymity, may or may not be important. It depends on the organization, but it's something to consider. If you are in that situation, you may need to do the second option, which is a survey approach. Now, this is usually for the bigger companies where we try to set up questions to decide what is the area you want to look at. If a board was more interested in having handled this as opposed to bringing it down to a level of the executive manager, they might want to use the surveys as opposed to being involved in that process. So we try to elicit data on the controls, the risks, and the processes that are existing. It's a big difference from the current questionnaires that the auditors are using, because it's really in the form of a survey, so that makes it very comfortable and easy for people to feel relaxed to give information on. And coming from the operational employees, it's a really good source. And we're finding that as people get into self-evaluation of their role, it creates ownership of the job, of the controls they're doing, and it tends to build pride. So there is a separate side of this that can help in making it better overall. So we talked about what was needed just for the basic financial reporting, we want to try to see whether or not we can get more for better than basic controls, get the best practices. Sorry, these are the same notes. So it's not, I know your people are doing a lot more than we're quantifying, and it's hard for us to tell as auditors. And it would be helpful for us to know it, and I think it's helpful to really understand it. I know a number of the executive managers in the industry really know what's going on with all their people, but I wonder whether that's happening everywhere. And then when there's a transfer and somebody leaves, a turnover, do the controls continue without written procedures? In a 2-week cross-training, let's say, which is the optimum way you go from one person to the next, I'm not finding that in my firm works. So I'm knowing I have to retrain the new person regardless when they bring them in. I don't know whether that always happens in all organizations, so I know it's one of the concerns I have when I change an employee. I guess I'd like you guys to ask yourselves, do you know what was done and when it was done and if it wasn't done? That's the hardest part. That's where the monitoring comes. That's where the part seems to get lost in internal controls. And just to give you an example of our practice of about 140 co-ops and condos, we probably have 40% which are at very good practices. We have 40% which we constantly need to give work to, and we're constantly reminding the last 20% that they're really just on the verge, that all we can do is do a financial statement. We can't give any more than that if they even asked us to. So it just gives you some feedback as to what's going on in the industry, the way it's functioning. The last 2 pages of the handout I thought might be something that we could sort of just utilize to take a look at. It's an excerpt from a document we're going to be putting up on our website as part of this. We're still working our way through it. So one area was the segregation of duties, and on the slide here I have the heading so you know which one it is. So in this example, we have a total of 7 different people who might be involved. And we can get internal controls with 2 or 3 people. It's very difficult. On most of your organizations, I'm sure we're much higher that there's more people around. But we definitely have the basic clerks or the bookkeepers. There's some type of administration, and IT is such an important part on internal control because we rely so much on computers these days, that's another area. We tend to want to find out that somebody separate's doing bank reconciliation. And a number of these overlap: boards, property managers, financial executives, can overlap. I have a lot of treasurers who really serve as financial executives for their properties, and then whether or not you have resident manager or super property manager. So I just wanted you to see, and the handout is designed to give you just an idea of some guidelines that we are comfortable putting out as to how to try to spread the load and make sure that we've got the crosses in and we've got adequate segregation of duties. It's really very hard to do that, and a lot of times it's not the most efficient. And again, on a change of employees from one to another, we'll possibly lose some type of job because maybe temporarily it goes to somebody else, and then it doesn't go back to the other person after the new person starts for whatever reason. And then we have a lot of cases where somebody's handling all of the bills, all of the payment of the bills, and the only outside item in accounts payable is the signing of checks. So I wanted to take an example of payroll because I think it's the easiest one to follow as far as doing the payroll function. And so these were the different aspects of what each area would do. And it's a little hard sometimes these days with the payroll companies that produce the signed checks. So therefore, the documents need to go directly to the financial executive. That's where you need the monitoring. But each one of these is brought down because the list can be long if you look at payroll in the other sheet I gave you. But here it is, just trying to spread the load is an important item. And it doesn't have to be these names. You could use, let's say, another clerk to do a number of these. So where you have an accounts payable, an accounts receivable, and a bank reconciliation clerk, let's say, each one of those can serve in a different area. It's just the fact that there be a different person. But this number of aspects is best practices of control of something as simple as payroll. We're very form-based. I don't know that works for everybody. Maybe that's just the fact of where I was, why I chose to be an auditor. So I guess the way we thought, we brought things down to the forms that we needed in order to have best practices. So we tried to give you the list of that. So this slide sort of gives you the breakdown of the 16 forms that potentially need to be created or need to be used. And some of them you're already doing. I'm sure a bank rec exists. And the other ones, we don't always, we know it's being done. We know there's a year-end closing. We know there's a month-end closing, but I don't know that there's a checklist of all of the procedures to be done. I know that I don't always find it when we're doing auditing. So then we have to go to inquiry and observation and make sure that it's done. And I guess that's what I'm trying to bring down is in this table that we can bring this down to being done in just these aspects. Maybe it's a matter of talking and developing these documents if we don't have them already. Having a schedule that they be brought in. So something like annual employee reviews, I'm sure they're done. There's just some things that, let's say, employees needed to be reminded on about ethics and integrity. You're not going to accept fraud. No kickbacks are allowed. It may be in a policy manual. An annual signing of the policy manual is another option. But I don't always see those things when I'm going through the documentation. So that's the reason why I just wanted to reinforce it to you that these would ultimately be the types of goals that we were looking for. I thought bill paying would be a good one to look at to see how simple this could be, because it can be overwhelming if you look at some of the controls that are out there. There's probably 60 basic financial controls, not including controls over operation of the property. And so there are 4 functions here on this slide that are done by 2 separate individuals. And the first part, generally we see happens, so that's easy. The problem is and I don't really know the answer to this one, is when the check signer signs, are they reviewing the documentation? And I assume they realize that they're approving and authorizing the transaction when they sign the check. So the question is, how do we get this into a format that allows for evidence that it was done? I'm pretty comfortable if there's once a year the board determines who the check signers are, and as part of that there is an understanding either reflected in the board minutes or some other way that they realize that they're acknowledging that they reviewed the documentation that was there to some extent, and that they're authorizing the transaction when they sign the check, resolves the issue. It's expected, it's understood, but when we find out things happen after the fact, somebody will say, I wasn't doing that, and that's the only time we tend to find out what it is. So those were just a couple of the examples I thought might be helpful to give you some ideas of that it's not a huge project to try to take on taking a look at this detail. So to sort of conclude, we want to try to find changes and there be consistency in procedures applied over time. As I said, my experience in the industry, things change, the people change, board members change, managers change, and there tends to be changes that are not always documented when that occurs. This process will take a look at procedural problems because you'll now find out what the issues are and you can work to improve them where you get effectiveness and efficiency. You'll find errors and irregularities more often. You'll probably find them out just in having a meeting with each different area as to what's going on. People will easily share if they feel comfortable. It'll give you the opportunity to recommend controls, and those recommendations from controls can come from the low-level people who are doing the work who will make it the most efficient way possible, as opposed to what an outside consultant might end up saying is the best way to handle that. And it'll also allow you to come up with procedural improvements, which I think we're all looking for, the most efficient operations and ability to function and the best functioning employees that we can have.